welcome to my channel. Today's story is a journey of secrets, transformation, and a side of myself. You told yourself it was just curiosity, just for a moment, but the reflection staring back felt unexpectedly right. I want to start by telling you something I have never quite been able to say out loud without my voice catching somewhere in the middle of it. Not because the words themselves are dangerous, but because they carry with them so many years of quiet, private wrestling, years of lying awake in the dark asking questions I didn't have the vocabulary for, years of wearing a version of myself in public that felt slightly too tight, like a coat borrowed from someone else's life. What I want to say is this: I didn't choose the moment that changed me. It arrived on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon in my 23rd year, dressed up, quite literally, as something ridiculous and harmless. A work charity fundraiser. A dare. A costume. And what unfolded from that single, laughing, deeply uncomfortable afternoon became the most important education of my entire life. But to understand what that moment meant, you first have to understand who I was before it. And to understand who I was before it, you have to go back much further than a Wednesday afternoon. You have to go back to a small boy sitting in the quiet of his parents' house, trying to understand why the world seemed to be divided into two very neat categories that he didn't quite fit into, not painfully, not obviously, just slightly. Just enough to notice. I grew up in a mid-sized city, the second of 3 children, in a household that was loving in the practical, functional sense of the word. My father was an engineer, methodical, logical, steady as a wall. My mother was a secondary school teacher, warm but organized, someone who believed deeply in doing things properly. They were not unkind. They were not especially rigid. They were, in the way of many families of their generation and background, simply operating within a set of assumptions about how people were supposed to be, about what boys were supposed to want and how girls were supposed to move through the world, and those assumptions were so thoroughly embedded in the atmosphere of our home that nobody ever thought to examine them. They were just the air we breathed. My older sister, Nina, was everything that her category seemed to require: poised, socially brilliant, passionate about art and fashion, and the kind of emotional complexity that I admired from a distance but didn't know how to access. My younger brother, Callum, came along 5 years after me and arrived already knowing how to be a boy in the way the world meant it: loud, physical, instinctively drawn to competition and machines, and the kind of friendships that were conducted entirely through mock combat. And then there was me. Daniel. Sitting in the middle, watching both of them with equal parts admiration and confusion. I wasn't a troubled child. I want to be very clear about that, because I think there's a tendency, when you tell a story like mine, to retroactively paint the childhood as a series of warning signs, a trail of clues that all pointed towards some inevitable revelation. That's not how I remember it. What I remember is a child who was thoughtful and moderately bookish and who liked football well enough but also liked drawing, who had good friends and occasional enemies, who found school tolerable and summer holidays wonderful, and who moved through those years with most of the ordinary mixture of joy and boredom and low-grade anxiety that constitutes a reasonably normal childhood. There was nothing dramatic. There was just, occasionally, a small and nameless feeling of being slightly elsewhere. I remember one afternoon when I was perhaps 8 or 9. Nina had been given a dressing-up box full of old clothes, donated by a relative cleaning out their wardrobe, scarves and jackets and a pair of elaborate beaded earrings and several formal dresses from decades past. She and her friends spent an entire Saturday afternoon in her bedroom playing some kind of elaborate fashion show, and at some point I wandered in, probably intending to complain about noise or to borrow something of hers, and I stood in the doorway and watched them for a moment. The color and movement and self-conscious laughter of it, and felt something I couldn't name. Not desire, exactly. Not longing, precisely. Something more like recognition, almost. As if something in the scene was speaking a language I half understood. I stood there for perhaps 30 seconds before Nina spotted me and told me to get out, which I did, and I spent approximately 0 further time thinking about it. I was 8. I had a life to get on with. But the memory sat somewhere inside me, filed under nothing in particular, waiting. Through my teenage years I was, as most teenagers are, primarily occupied with the business of trying to understand who I was in relation to other people, which friendships mattered, which social hierarchies were worth navigating, what kind of person I wanted others to think I was. I was reasonably popular in the unsentimental way of boys who are sociable but not charismatic, who play sport well enough to belong but not well enough to lead. I had a close group of 3 friends, Marcus, James, and Dev, and we spent those years together in the particular companionable intimacy that male friendship often takes, which is to say we shared almost everything about our outer lives and almost nothing about our inner ones, because that was the understood agreement, the unspoken rule of the road. I dated, a little. Had a girlfriend for most of year 12, a quiet and intelligent girl named Sarah whose intelligence I liked and whose patience with my emotional unavailability I now find remarkable. We broke up amicably when we went to different universities, and I remember thinking, in the honest part of myself, that what I felt about the end of it was mostly relief, not because I didn't like her, but because the relationship had always felt somewhat performed. Not dishonestly, exactly. I cared about her genuinely. But there was always a slight sensation of playing a part that someone else had written, of saying lines that were expected rather than felt. I told myself this was just immaturity. I was 17. I told myself I would figure it out. University expanded me in the ways universities are supposed to. I studied environmental science, which I had chosen partly from genuine interest and partly because it was the intersection of several subjects I was reasonably good at. I made new friends. I read more widely. I became, gradually, a more articulate version of myself, better at expressing opinions, more comfortable disagreeing, more curious about the world in a deliberate rather than passive way. I had more relationships, some of them richer and more honest than the one with Sarah had been. I started to understand something about intimacy that I hadn't understood before, which was that it required showing up as yourself rather than as an acceptable approximation of yourself. I was making progress. I thought I was pretty close to knowing who I was. And then I graduated, got a job at a mid-level environmental consultancy in the city, rented a flat with Marcus, who had followed a similar professional trajectory, and began what everyone around me was calling real life. And real life, it turned out, was mostly fine. I was competent at my job. I liked my colleagues. Marcus and I had an easy and comfortable domestic arrangement. I was, by any reasonable external measurement, doing well. I jogged 3 times a week. I called my parents on Sundays. I was, as far as I could tell, a functional, grounded, mostly contented adult. The only thing I could not quite account for, the only thing that didn't fit neatly into the picture, was the occasional feeling, still nameless, still quiet, of being slightly beside myself. Of watching my own life from a small distance, as if I were looking at someone who was me but was not quite entirely me. It wasn't depression. I knew enough about depression by then to know the difference. It wasn't anxiety. It was something stranger and more neutral than either of those things. It was more like the faint awareness that there was a room in the house of myself that I had never opened, and I wasn't sure whether I was choosing not to open it or whether I simply didn't know where the door was. And then came the Wednesday. Our company, a team of around 30 people, genuinely good-natured and socially enthusiastic in the way that environmental consultancies tend to be, had organized an annual charity fundraiser. In previous years it had been a bake sale, a sponsored bike ride, a quiz night. This year, someone in the social committee, I suspected Priya, who had an irrepressible love of elaborate schemes, had proposed something more theatrical. The theme was role reversal. Men in the office would dress as women, women as men, and the whole event would be a costume party fundraiser in the office common room on a Friday afternoon, with colleagues voting for best outfit and proceeds going to a mental health charity. The announcement was met with the usual mixture of enthusiasm and groaning. Most of the men in the office treated it as a comedy exercise, a chance to put on something ridiculous and be applauded for their willingness to look foolish. There was no shortage of humor about it in the weeks beforehand. The men in my immediate team, Rob, Chris, and a newer recruit named Elliot, immediately began competing over who could assemble the most absurd costume, the kind of oversized, exaggerated burlesque of femininity that was clearly designed to signal that they were doing this as a joke, that the joke was the costume, and that the costume therefore required no actual engagement with the thing it was parodying. I laughed along. I agreed to participate. I told myself I'd find something suitably ridiculous. A wig, some heels, a floral dress 3 sizes too large. Something that said, I am a man being very obviously funny. But the Friday crept up on me faster than I expected, and by the evening before, I had nothing. I had genuinely forgotten to organize a costume. I was standing in my flat, mildly panicked, texting Marcus, who was working late, and thinking through my options, when my phone rang. It was Nina. She had called, as she did most weeks, about nothing in particular, a catch-up, a conversation about our mother's recent health scare, something she'd read. I mentioned my predicament almost as an aside, as something funny, and Nina, who had spent the past decade working in fashion retail and had accumulated the wardrobe of 3 separate lifetimes, immediately said she could help. She lived 15 minutes away. She had things. She had many things. I went over. What I want to say about the next 2 hours is that they were ordinary in their texture and extraordinary in their effect. Nina's flat was exactly as you might imagine it, large wardrobes lining an entire wall of her bedroom, rails of clothes in the corridor, shoes in stacked boxes with Polaroid photographs on the front so she could identify them without opening each one. She was cheerful and practical about the whole thing, approaching it the way she approached everything, as a project with a correct answer. She pulled things out and held them up and assessed them and put them back. She asked me questions about the tone of the event, whether it was supposed to be funny or sincere, whether anyone else was doing something relatively genuine or whether everyone was going for comedy. I said I wasn't sure. She said she'd on the side of something that fitted properly, because things that fitted properly were always more interesting than things that were deliberately too large. She settled on a knee-length pleated skirt in a deep burgundy, a simple cream blouse, and a pair of low-heeled ankle boots that were, against all probability, almost exactly my size. She was not interested in a wig, she said wigs were the easy comedic escape route and that I should just be myself with good clothes. She spent about 20 minutes on a makeup look that she described as, barely anything, just some structure, which turned out to mean a light base that evened my skin tone, a little definition at the brows, and something at the eyes that I didn't have words for but that, when I looked in her mirror, made my eyes look more awake than I had ever noticed them looking. She stood back, tilted her head, and said, quietly and simply, "Oh. That's actually really nice." I looked at myself in the mirror. I want to try to explain what happened in that moment as accurately as I can, because I have spent a long time trying to understand it, and I still don't think I have language that is fully equal to it. What I felt was not euphoria. It was not some cinematic transformation. It was something quieter and more disorienting than that, something that sat somewhere in the middle of recognition and strangeness at the same time. I looked like myself. I looked unmistakably like Daniel. The same jaw, the same nose, the same slightly tired eyes. But the overall impression of the person in the mirror was one I had not seen before, and the thing that disturbed me, in the truest sense of that word, the sense of being displaced from a settled position, was that the person I was looking at seemed, in some quality I couldn't identify, more at ease than the person I was used to looking at. Not more beautiful. Not transformed. Just, more settled, somehow. As if something that was usually slightly braced in my face had, in this configuration, let go. Nina was watching me carefully, the way she had watched things carefully her whole life. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "You okay?" And I said, Yeah, I'm fine. It's good. It's funny." And she said, "Sure. But are you okay?" And I said, yes, which was both true and completely insufficient. I drove home. I hung the clothes carefully in my wardrobe. I sat on the edge of my bed for quite a long time, thinking about nothing particular, not quite ready to think about anything particular. The next morning I wore the outfit to work. The office reaction was what you'd expect from a workplace that was genuinely warm and non-judgmental. There was laughter, but it was the affectionate kind. Rob had arrived in a sundress and a bright orange wig that he was clearly enormously enjoying. Chris had made a spirited effort with a sequined blazer and platform shoes. Elliot had gone full theatrical in a ball gown that he was navigating with tremendous difficulty and great good humor. I was, by comparison, relatively understated. A few people said I looked genuinely pretty good, which made me laugh, and I said thank you, and I meant it, and I kept thinking about the quality of my own voice saying thank you, whether it sounded like a joke or not, whether I wanted it to sound like a joke or not. The afternoon passed in the way that office parties pass, with a backdrop of noise and goodwill and slightly forced fun, with speeches and voting and a raffle, and gradually the costumes became familiar and people stopped looking at them and started just talking to each other the way they normally talked. And somewhere in the middle of that normality, something shifted for me in a way I was not prepared for. I was standing by the window with a cup of tea, talking to one of my colleagues, a woman named Diane who worked in our data analysis team and with whom I rarely had occasion to speak about anything other than project timelines. She was asking me about a project we were both peripherally involved with, and as we talked I became aware of something I felt, in that conversation, unusually present. Unusually at ease. Not because of Diane particularly, though she was excellent company, but because of something about the way I was occupying the moment. There was no performance going on. There was no monitoring of whether I was being sufficiently masculine, or competent, or amusing, or whatever the usual background checklist said. I was just there. Talking. Interested in what she was saying. Comfortable in a way that felt both ordinary and revelatory in the same breath. Later, walking home, I had changed back into my usual clothes before leaving, which had felt, and I noted the feeling precisely, slightly disappointing. I tried to work out what had happened. I tried to be analytical about it, the way my father would have been. I thought, maybe it was just the costume liberating you from your usual identity, the way any carnival or costume event liberates people from their daily performance of self. Maybe it was the novelty. Maybe it was the permission. Because there had been permission, I realized the event had given everyone permission to be different for a day, and I had walked through that permission and found something on the other side of it that I didn't expect. But that explanation, useful as it was, didn't quite reach the image in Nina's mirror. It didn't account for the quality of recognition I had felt looking at myself in those clothes that fitted properly, those clothes that were just clothes. It didn't explain why the slightly disappointing was the word my mind had reached for when I took them off. I went home and made dinner and watched something on television and did not think about it. Or rather, I thought about other things deliberately and specifically in order not to think about it. Which is a technique I had used before with uncomfortable thoughts, and which works, in the short term, with the reliability of a cheap lock. It keeps the door shut just long enough for you to pretend you've dealt with it. That night, lying in the dark, the thought came back. Not as a catastrophe. Not as a crisis. Just as a quiet question, sitting at the edge of my consciousness like someone waiting patiently to be acknowledged. The question was, what was that? And the honest part of me, the part that had always been slightly better at truth than I was comfortable with, answered, I don't know. But it was something. And I think you need to find out what. The weeks that followed were strange in a way that is hard to communicate without sounding melodramatic, because nothing externally dramatic was happening. I went to work. I went to the gym. I had dinner with Marcus and with friends. I called my parents. The ordinary architecture of my life continued, completely unchanged to any observer. But underneath it, something had been set in motion that I didn't know how to stop and wasn't sure I wanted to. A process that I can only describe as attention, the beginning of paying careful, sustained attention to something I had been not quite ignoring for a very long time. I started, tentatively, to explore the question through reading. At first I searched things online with the specific furtiveness of someone who has been trained by years of social conditioning to feel that certain searches are compromising, who deletes their browser history not because they've done anything wrong but because the shape of the inquiry feels like something to be hidden. I hated that furtiveness even as I gave in to it. I found articles about crossdressing, about gender expression, about the difference between crossdressing as identity and crossdressing as practice, about the broad spectrum of reasons people engage with it, from performance art to personal comfort to identity exploration to something that sat adjacent to but was not entirely subsumed by discussions of gender identity. I found forums where people spoke about their experiences with a directness and intelligence that I found simultaneously relieving and destabilizing. Relieving because the vocabulary was there, because other people had been here before me, because I was apparently not the first person to be standing in front of a mirror in borrowed clothes feeling a complicated thing. Destabilizing because the mere fact of engaging with these resources made everything more real, moved it from the category of private passing curiosity into something that was going to require a reckoning. I want to talk about the shame, because it was there and it was real, and I think pretending it wasn't would be dishonest and would also do a disservice to anyone reading this who is sitting with a similar weight. The shame was not the kind that comes from having done something wrong. I knew I hadn't done anything wrong. Intellectually, I was perfectly clear that wearing different clothes was a category of activity located somewhere between utterly trivial and deeply meaningful, that it harmed no one, that it said nothing morally meaningful about me, that the cultural framework that attached shame to it was a historical artifact of specific social anxieties and not a reflection of any objective moral reality. I knew all of this. I could have argued it with force and coherence to anyone who challenged me. And yet, the shame was there. It sat in my chest like a low-grade vibration, a static noise. It did not come from within my own values. It came from a lifetime of absorbing a world that had very particular ideas about what men did and did not do, and that had spent 2+ decades delivering those ideas to me not through explicit instruction but through the infinitely more powerful medium of ambient expectation. The shame was not mine, in the sense that it didn't belong to my actual beliefs. But it lived in my body as if it did. And having an intellectual argument with your own nervous system is about as effective as it sounds. What I did, during those weeks and months, was refuse to act on the shame. I didn't suppress the curiosity. I kept reading. I kept thinking. I kept paying attention to the question, even when the question was uncomfortable, because I had arrived at the understanding, slowly, imperfectly, that the discomfort of honest self-inquiry is a very different kind of discomfort from the discomfort of self-suppression, and that one of them leads somewhere and the other one leads nowhere. I had spent enough years in the low-grade nowhere of being slightly beside myself to have developed a preference. I bought a skirt. I want to say that simply and without ceremony, because the simplicity was important to me. I didn't want to give it more drama than it deserved, and I didn't want to give it less either. I was standing in a shop on a Saturday afternoon, technically looking for a birthday present for my mother, and I found myself in a section of the shop that I would normally have passed through without stopping, and I stopped. I looked at things. I assessed them with the same analytical approach I would have brought to any purchase. I found a skirt, mid-length, navy blue, a simple clean thing, in what I judged was roughly my size, and I put it in my basket alongside the scarf I was getting for my mother, and I paid for both items at the same till, and I walked out. The woman at the till asked if I'd like them wrapped separately. I said yes. She wrapped them separately without asking anything else, because she was a professional doing her job, and because of course it was none of her business, and because actually I think most people in the world are far less interested in other people's purchases than the shame noise in our heads tells us they are. I took the skirt home. I tried it on. I stood in front of the mirror in my bedroom, alone, on a Saturday afternoon, and looked at myself. And the feeling was the same one I'd had in Nina's flat, that quality of ease, of something slightly unclenched, of being slightly more fully present in my own reflection than I usually was. And I also felt fear. Both things at once, which is, I have come to understand, the standard configuration for any genuinely important moment of self-discovery. Ease and fear, moving together, neither canceling the other out. I wore it for perhaps 20 minutes. Then I hung it in the back of my wardrobe. Then I went for a long walk, the kind of walk I take when I need to think, through the park along the river, in the fading autumn light, with my hands in my pockets and my thoughts moving the way they move on such walks, slowly, circularly, with occasional moments of unexpected clarity. What I thought about, on that walk, was not the skirt itself. The skirt was only an object, and objects are never really the point. What I thought about was the larger question that the skirt was a door into, the question of identity, of what it means to know yourself, of how much of who we are is genuinely our own construction versus a set of inherited categories that we've been slotted into and have gradually, through the pressure of repetition, come to mistake for the truth of ourselves. Because here is what I had begun to understand, and what I want to try to articulate carefully because I think it matters beyond the specific question of crossdressing, beyond my specific experience. We all arrive in the world without a fixed identity. We are given one, gradually and persistently, by the world around us, by family, by culture, by religion, by media, by the accumulated weight of other people's expectations. This is not, primarily, a sinister thing. Community identity and shared norms are part of how human beings coordinate themselves into societies that function. But the process of receiving an identity is different from the process of choosing one, of examining what you've received and deciding what fits and what doesn't, of separating the genuine from the merely assigned. And that examination, that courageous, uncomfortable, necessary examination, is something that most people in my experience spend enormous energy avoiding, because it's easier to accept the version of yourself that others hand you than to do the slow work of building one from the inside out. What the skirt was telling me, what the afternoon at Nina's flat had been telling me, in the language of that quiet feeling of recognition, was that there was something in the category of how I express myself in the world that I had not chosen, had only inherited, and that the inherited version didn't fit quite right. Not painfully. Not dramatically. But not quite right. I should say here, clearly and explicitly, that I am not transgender, that I do not experience gender dysphoria, that what I am describing is not a story about discovering a gender identity that was different from the one I was assigned at birth. I want to say that clearly because I think it's important not to conflate different experiences, not to appropriate a language that belongs to a different journey. What I am describing is something that exists in a distinct and valid category of its own, a form of gender expression that involves moving between or across the socially assigned boundaries of masculine and feminine presentation, finding something meaningful and authentic and personally true in that movement, without that movement constituting a claim about the fundamental nature of one's gender. Crossdressing, for me, was and is an expressive practice, a way of accessing and articulating aspects of myself that the narrow code of conventional masculinity left without a vocabulary. That is different from, though related to, and entirely worthy of the same respect as transgender experience. Both are real. Both matter. Neither explains the other. I spent several months living with this understanding privately. I want to be honest about what that period was like, because I think it's important not to rush the narrative toward resolution in a way that makes the middle section, the long uncomfortable middle, seem shorter or easier than it was. Living with a self-knowledge that you haven't yet shared with anyone is its own particular experience. It has qualities of relief. You are no longer not knowing, no longer half aware and half avoiding, and that is genuinely better than the fog of the before. But it also has qualities of loneliness, because the self-knowledge is yours alone, and you are aware, every time you are with the people who matter most to you, that there is something real and important about who you are that they don't know, and that the not knowing is a wall between you and a certain kind of closeness. I became, during this period, both more honest and more guarded at the same time, which sounds paradoxical but is entirely coherent, more honest with myself, which meant seeing the people in my life with clearer eyes, appreciating them more accurately, noticing both their generosity and their limitations with greater precision, more guarded in social situations, because I was aware of carrying something that I wasn't ready to share, but that made the performance of ordinary social life feel more effortful than usual. I got better at solitude. I got better at thinking. I got worse, temporarily, at the easy cheerful sociability that I had always relied on as a social default, the kind of witty engagement that keeps a room comfortable and asks nothing of anyone. Marcus noticed, because Marcus had known me for a long time and was more observant than he let on in his easy, steady way. He asked me once, over dinner in our kitchen, whether I was all right, not in the passing way, but in the sitting down and looking at you way. I said I was thinking through some things. He said okay. He poured more wine. He didn't push. This is Marcus's particular genius. He creates space without requiring it to be filled, which is one of the rarer and more valuable social gifts I know of, and I will be grateful for it for the rest of my life. I talked to a therapist. I want to say this as plainly and undramatically as I can, because I think there is still, even now, even among people who would claim to be modern and progressive about mental health, a residual idea that seeking therapy is either a last resort or an admission of fragility. And I would like to push back against that idea with everything I have. I sought therapy not because I was broken but because I had a complicated question that deserved careful examination and I wanted a trained and neutral interlocutor to help me examine it. That's what therapy is for. I found a therapist through a recommendation, a woman named Helen who worked 3 days a week from a quiet room above a bookshop, which is an environment so perfectly calibrated for introspective conversation that it feels almost fictional, and I went to see her every Thursday for a year. What Helen gave me was not answers. She was very clear about the fact that she was not in the answer business. What she gave me was better questions, and the discipline of sitting with the questions long enough to let them resolve into something resembling understanding rather than rushing past them toward the comfort of easy conclusions. She gave me frameworks that helped me see my experience more clearly, not just the crossdressing itself, but the whole interlocking structure of identity, expectation, shame, performance, and self-concealment that surrounded it. She helped me see that the shame was not a verdict on my character but a residue of conditioning, and that recognizing it as such was the first step toward not being governed by it. She helped me understand that my resistance to sharing this part of myself with others was not just shyness but a specific learned response to years of ambient messages about what men were and were not allowed to be, and that those messages had been delivered to me by a world that meant well in its own limited way but was wrong about a great many things. She also helped me understand something that surprised me, which was the degree to which my identity questions were not unique. This is both a mundane and a profound truth. The specific content varies, for some people it's gender expression, for others it's sexuality, for others it's faith or cultural identity or professional self-concept or any of the dozen other axes along which human beings construct their sense of who they are. But the experience of having inherited an identity that doesn't quite fit, of feeling slightly beside yourself, of carrying something private and significant in the middle of an otherwise normal life, that experience is, it turns out, extremely common. What varies is not the experience but the willingness to acknowledge it. And the willingness to acknowledge it is what determines whether it becomes a source of self-knowledge and growth or a source of lifelong friction and quiet suffering. I chose, at some point during that year with Helen, to acknowledge it. To myself, first. To stop framing what I was experiencing as a problem to be solved or a tendency to be managed and start framing it as a fact about who I was, a real and legitimate and morally neutral fact, like being left-handed or having synesthesia, a thing that existed in the particular fabric of myself and that would simply have to be integrated into my understanding of who I was and how I wanted to live. This was easier to say than to do. Let me be very honest about that. There were weeks when I thought I had made peace with it and then found myself, at some unexpected moment, a comment in a conversation, a particular look from a stranger, a scene in a film that I suddenly found myself on the wrong side of, falling back into the old shame noise, the old crouch of self-concealment. The path towards self-acceptance is not a straight line. It's more like a coastline, you're always moving in the right direction, more or less, but there are constant inlets and headlands, places where you go backward before you go forward again, and the overall direction is only visible from a long distance. The person I told first, after Nina, and I should say that Nina and I had, by this point, a much fuller conversation than the one in her flat, a proper, long, late-night conversation in which I told her what I had been thinking and she listened with the particular quality of attention that sisters, at their best, can offer. The first new person I told was Marcus. It was a Sunday morning, almost a year after the charity fundraiser. We were sitting in the kitchen with coffee, the Sunday paper distributed across the table, the specific unhurried texture of a weekend morning. I had been carrying the intention to tell him for several weeks, and the moment arrived not with drama but with the kind of quiet inevitability that important moments sometimes have. Suddenly it was the right time, and I knew it was the right time, and so I said it. I told him the whole thing. The afternoon at Nina's. The months of reading and thinking. The therapy. The fact that this was a real part of who I was and that I had spent the better part of a year understanding that and was now ready to stop pretending it wasn't. I spoke for a long time without interruption, because Marcus has the listening skills of someone who was perhaps a therapist in a previous life, and when I finished he said, without skipping a beat, "Okay. Thanks for telling me. Does this change anything?" And I said, "No, I think it just makes things more accurate." And he said, "Good. Then I'm glad you told me." And he poured more coffee, and we sat there in the Sunday morning, and the world continued. I cannot overstate how much that conversation mattered. Not because Marcus said anything extraordinary, the thing that made it matter was precisely that he didn't, that his response was so completely undramatic, so grounded in the simple logic of friendship, which is that you accept the people you love as they are. What that response did to me, in the hours and days after it, was begin a process of disentangling my identity from the fear of judgment that had been wound around it for so long that the two things had become hard to separate. The fear had told me, for years, that the people who knew me would see me differently, value me less, be confused or disapproving or awkward, that sharing this real thing about myself would constitute a loss of some kind. What Marcus's response showed me was that the fear was a liar. That the people who genuinely knew me and cared about me would, if given the chance, simply adjust the picture they had of me to include this additional true thing, the same way we all continuously adjust our pictures of the people we love as we learn more about them. Telling my parents was different. I want to spend some real time on this because I think it represents a genuinely difficult and common experience, the experience of telling the people who formed you about something that challenges the version of you they formed. My parents were not, as I have said, unkind people. But they were people of their generation and their background, with the emotional vocabulary of that generation and background, and I knew that what I was going to tell them would land not as something they had any framework for but as something entirely unfamiliar, something they would need time and space to understand. I told them separately at first, which in retrospect was the right instinct. Telling people separately gives each of them space to have their authentic response without moderating it for the other person's benefit, and it allows you to have two genuine conversations rather than one managed performance. I told my mother first. She was quiet for a long time, then she asked several practical questions. Was I all right? Was I seeing anyone I could talk to? Did this have anything to do with how I felt about my identity more broadly? I explained as clearly and honestly as I could. I told her about Helen. I told her that I was well and grounded and not in any distress, that this was not a revelation that had destabilized me but one that had, after a long process, made me more stable. She said she needed time to think. I said of course. We had a long hug at the door when I left that said, in the language of physical presence, more than either of us had managed in words. My father took longer. He was not hostile, he was never hostile, but he was genuinely baffled in a way that I think was honest and, in its own way, respectful. He didn't pretend to understand something he didn't understand. He asked me, in the direct way of engineers, to explain the logic of it, to help him see what it meant and what it didn't mean, to give him a map of the territory. I did my best. I explained the difference between gender expression and gender identity. I explained that this was about a form of self-expression that I found meaningful and authentic, not about rejecting who I was or who he knew me to be. I told him that I was still his son, still the person he had known my whole life, and that what had changed was only that he now had more information about that person, not different information. He sat with this for a while. Then he said, in the careful way of someone who is trying to be accurate, I don't fully understand it yet. But I understand that you've thought about it very carefully, and I trust that. And that was enough. That was more than enough, actually. It was the beginning of something. In the months that followed, my relationship with my parents changed in a way that I find, even now, somewhat remarkable. Not because of the specific content of what I had shared with them, but because the act of sharing it, of being fully honest about a real part of myself rather than managing their perception of me, removed a specific quality of distance from our interactions that I hadn't entirely noticed was there. We started talking differently. More directly. More personally. My mother began asking me questions about my inner life that she had never asked before, as if my honesty had given her permission to be curious. My father and I started having conversations about identity and belonging and what it meant to live authentically that neither of us would have considered 2 years earlier. The thing I had been afraid would create a wall turned out to have demolished one that was already standing. I want to address, at this point in the story, something that I think deserves direct and thoughtful engagement, because I think it comes up for most people who are navigating identity questions that intersect with social norms, and it came up for me, the question of how to engage with a world that has strong opinions about the thing you are. Not every conversation I had went the way my conversations with Marcus and my family went. There were awkward moments. There was a colleague who found out through the office event gossip and who, I could tell from his demeanor afterward, had reconfigured his opinion of me in ways that were not entirely favorable. There was a period of social anxiety at a new social circle where I wasn't sure how much of myself to bring into the room, where I oscillated between over-disclosure and over-concealment. There was a relationship that ended partly, I believe, because the person I was seeing had difficulty with the territory of gender nonconformity and found the cognitive dissonance of it, of someone they were attracted to who engaged in a behavior they associated with comedy or transgression, too difficult to hold without simplifying it into something more manageable and less true. These experiences hurt. I want to say that clearly, without diminishing them or rushing past them toward the more comfortable parts of the story. They hurt because they confirmed the fear that the shame noise had always been selling, that being honestly yourself was risky, that the cost of authenticity was real and would be paid in social currency. But what I learned from each of them, slowly and sometimes painfully, was that the hurt they caused was a different kind of hurt from the hurt of self-concealment. The hurt of honest exposure is clean, in a way. It is the hurt of the world disagreeing with you, which is painful but not poisonous. The hurt of self-concealment is something else. It is slow and accumulative and directionless, a debt that grows with interest, paid against your own vitality rather than against the world's judgment. I had lived with the second kind of hurt for many years. I chose the first kind, not because it was easier but because it was honest, and because I had come to understand that honesty about oneself is not a luxury or a courage reserved for special people, it is a basic requirement for a life that feels, in the deepest sense, real. I want to say something about community, because I think it is an element of this kind of journey that often goes under-discussed in favor of the more dramatic personal narrative. During my second year of engaging honestly with this part of myself, I found my way, through the same online spaces where I had first begun to read and think, into communities of people who shared similar experiences. Spaces where the conversation was not about performance or exhibition but about the quiet, serious question of what it means to live as yourself in a world that has strong preferences about categories. These spaces were, in my experience, populated by a striking range of people, men and women and people who identified neither simply, from all sorts of backgrounds and ages and professions, with vastly different specific experiences but a shared orientation toward honesty and self-examination. Some of them had been navigating this for decades. Some were at the beginning of the road. All of them, in different ways, had something to teach me. What community gave me was not permission. I had already understood that I didn't need external permission to be who I was. What it gave me was evidence. Evidence that the experience I was having was real and shared, and had been navigated by many different people in many different ways, with many different outcomes. It gave me access to a kind of collective wisdom that no amount of solo thinking can replicate, the wisdom of lived experience, of people who had already made the mistakes I was about to make and the choices I was about to face, and who were generous enough to share what they had learned. It gave me role models in the deepest sense of the word, not celebrities or icons, just ordinary people who had integrated this part of themselves into full, engaged, meaningful lives without drama or apology. It also taught me something about empathy that I think is worth articulating carefully, because I think it has implications far beyond my specific experience. What the community showed me was how different every person's relationship to this territory was, how for some people cross-dressing was a private, occasional practice that they kept entirely to themselves and found deeply sustaining precisely because of its privacy. For others it was a more public part of their identity, integrated into their social lives and relationships. For some it was connected to questions of gender identity in complex ways that they were still working out. For others it was quite separate from those questions and existed simply as an expressive preference. What I understood, gradually and then completely, was that none of these people were wrong about their own experience. The range of ways that human beings relate to their own identities is genuinely vast, and the only coherent ethical position is to extend to everyone the same right to self-definition that you want for yourself, not to impose your own framework of meaning on someone else's different but equally valid experience. This was, in retrospect, one of the most valuable lessons of the whole journey. Not the lesson about gender expression specifically, but the lesson about the nature of identity itself, that it is irreducibly individual, that the categories and labels and frameworks we use are always approximations, always slightly too small for the reality they're trying to describe, and that the most honest and humane position is to hold them lightly, use them when they're useful, and be willing to revise them when the person in front of you is more complex than the category you're reaching for. By the time I reached my late 20s, 3 or 4 years after the Wednesday that started all of this, I had arrived somewhere that I can only describe as a kind of internal spaciousness. Not peace exactly, because peace implies an absence of conflict, and there was still conflict, still navigating, still the occasional difficult conversation and the occasional moment of social friction. But a spaciousness. Room inside myself where there hadn't been room before. The quality of being beside myself, that quiet persistent sensation of watching my own life from a slight distance, had, gradually and then mostly, gone. I was more often simply inside my life than adjacent to it. More often present than observed. I had also, in that time, developed a very different relationship with the clothes themselves. What had begun as a charged and uncertain encounter, the anxiety of the first shopping trip, the solitary minutes in front of the mirror, the sense of transgression mixed with recognition, had become something far less dramatic and far more integrated. I dressed differently some days, and not others. I had a wardrobe that blended clothing in a way that felt genuine rather than categorical, some things that would be called conventionally masculine, some that would be called conventionally feminine, some that sat somewhere in the space between, all of them chosen because they were what I actually liked, what felt like me, rather than because they met an external brief for what I was supposed to look like. I wore what I wanted, when I wanted, in contexts where it was appropriate, in the same way that I made every other choice about how I presented myself to the world, with awareness, with care for others, and with a fundamental loyalty to my own authentic sense of myself. I should say something about how this intersected with my relationships, because I think relationships are where identity questions are most practically tested, not in the mirror or the therapy room, but in the complex, reciprocal, imperfectly negotiated space between two people. There were relationships during this period that didn't work, for reasons both connected to and independent of this part of my identity. I am not going to pretend that full honesty about who you are is always immediately welcomed or easily accommodated, it isn't. There were people who wanted a version of me that was simpler, more conventional, more easily categorized, and who found the additional complexity that my honesty introduced into the relationship difficult or unwelcome. I tried, in each case, to treat that difficulty with respect, not defensiveness, not apology, but genuine acknowledgement that what I was bringing to the table was not something everyone was prepared to receive, and that someone's unpreparedness was not the same as someone's wrongness. What I eventually found, and this is one of the parts of the story that I tell with the most genuine joy, because I think it illustrates something important about the rewards of honest living, was a relationship in which I was known completely and loved specifically, a relationship built on the foundation of two people who had each done enough honest work on themselves to show up as who they actually were and to find that the person who showed up was exactly the person the other one wanted. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens because you do the work. It happens because you refuse, repeatedly and in the face of considerable social pressure, to trade your authentic self for a more acceptable approximation of it, and you hold out, not from stubbornness, but from an earned understanding that an approximation of love is not love, that being valued for who you seem to be rather than who you are is not connection, but a very elegant form of loneliness. I think often, even now, about the person I was before the Wednesday. I don't think about him with pity or with condescension. He was doing the best he could with the tools he had, which is the most any of us can say for ourselves at any given point. But I think about him with a particular tenderness, because I know what he was carrying and I know how long he carried it and I know how much lighter things became when he finally set it down. I think about the years of being slightly beside himself, of the low-grade fog of inherited identity that didn't quite fit, and I am grateful, with a specific and well-earned gratitude, that the Wednesday happened. That Priya organized the fundraiser. That I forgot to get a costume. That I rang Nina. That Nina's wardrobe was full and her attention was precise and her care was genuine and she spent 20 minutes on a makeup look she called barely anything, that turned out to be a doorway into the most important conversation I ever had with myself. I am also grateful, and this is perhaps the most important gratitude of all, for everyone who had the courage to tell their story before I had the vocabulary for mine. The people in those online spaces who wrote honestly about their experiences. The writers and thinkers who did the intellectual and emotional work of articulating what gender expression means and what it doesn't mean and why it matters. The friends and family members who, when handed an unexpected truth about someone they loved, chose curiosity over judgment and openness over reflex. These people made it easier for me to be who I am, and in the ongoing transmission of human understanding, the way one generation's hard-won wisdom becomes the next generation's slightly softer starting point, I hope that my willingness to be honest about this experience does the same for someone else. There are things I have learned that I want to be clear about, not as prescriptions. Nobody else's journey will look like mine, and I would never want to suggest otherwise, but as observations that felt true from where I was standing and that I offer in the spirit of one person sharing honestly with another. I learned that shame is not a signal from your conscience, it is residue from other people's fears. I learned that the difference between who we are and who we have been told to be is one of the most important spaces to explore, and one of the most neglected. I learned that asking for help, from a therapist, from a friend, from a community of strangers who have walked a similar road, is not weakness, it is the basic intelligence of a social animal understanding its own limitations. I learned that authenticity is not a destination but a practice, something you choose again and again in the face of repeated pressures to be easier, simpler, more categorically convenient. I learned that the people who love you for who you are will love you more, not less, when they know who you actually are. And I learned, perhaps most fundamentally, that the narrative we inherit about what we are supposed to be is only one possible story among many, and that the work of becoming a full human being is largely the work of editing that inherited story, keeping what is genuinely yours, releasing what was never yours to begin with, and writing the parts that are still unwritten with honesty and care and as much courage as you can muster on any given day. I am 31 now. I am, on most days, recognizably the person I was before the Wednesday, the same Daniel, the environmental consultant, the middle child, the friend to Marcus, the son of two people who love him and now know him better than they used to. I am also someone different from who I was, in the way that all of us are different when we have done honest work on ourselves, fuller, more articulate, more comfortable inside my own life, more capable of the kind of genuine connection that requires being genuinely present. I wear what I want. I talk about what matters to me. I try to extend to others the same generosity that I needed people to extend to me during the years when I was still figuring out what I was talking about. I try to be, in whatever space I find myself in, the kind of presence that makes it slightly safer for others to be honest, not by demanding honesty of them, but by offering it myself. And I think about that moment in Nina's flat, the mirror, the carefully fitted clothes, the makeup that was barely anything, the quality of ease in my own face that I had never seen before, and I think, what a strange, small, ordinary beginning for something so large. What an ordinary Wednesday to be the doorway into all of this. Because that is what I want you to take from this, if you take anything, not the specifics of my story, which are only mine, but the principle underneath them. The door to knowing yourself is almost never the dramatic, obvious one. It is usually something small. A borrowed costume. A chance conversation. A moment in a mirror on a Thursday afternoon. A skirt hanging in the back of a wardrobe. Something so small that you might walk right past it, if you are too busy or too frightened or too thoroughly convinced that who you already are is all there is to find. The door is usually small and ordinary and disguised as something slightly ridiculous, and the only question is whether, when you find yourself standing in front of it, you have the patience and the honesty and the courage to push it open and go through. I hope you do. I hope, if you are reading this at a point where there is something in yourself that you haven't yet examined, something that feels slightly beside your ordinary life and slightly too quiet to name, I hope you push the door. I hope you find what's on the other side. I hope it is, as it was for me, not a catastrophe but a gift. Not the end of something but the beginning of something more fully, more honestly, more beautifully your own. Thank you for watching and spending this time with me. If this story helped you understand yourself or others a little better, feel free to explore more on the channel.